I have cooked for kings that were not men, and I have buried more of their dead than I ever fed. And if you sit with me long enough by this fire, I will tell you the one thing I did that they still do not say aloud in that house. They say around it. They say the seat was kept. They say the winter passed. They do not say the cook. That is fine. A cook is not meant to be said. A cook is meant to be the reason the saying can happen at all, and then to go back to the pots. My name does not matter here, but they called me Halloran, and I was the only human in the seat of House Sarathi for near on 30 years. I came young and I stayed old. When I first walked up the Black Stone Road to that place, I was a hungry man selling the one thing hungry men from my world could sell, which was that we knew food. Not cooking, though I could cook. I mean, we knew food the way the Sarathi knew their long ledgers and their star charts and their 1,000-year grudges, in the body, in the blood, from before we could speak. Where I was born, a child learned which root put you to sleep and which one kept you from waking, and learned it beside the hearth from a grandmother's hands before he learned his letters. It was not a science to us. It was a manners. You did not serve a man a plate without knowing everything that plate could do to him. That was courtesy where I came from. Out there among the pale, tall people who took me in, it turned out to be the rarest thing in the galaxy. The Sarathi were a beautiful people, and I will not pretend otherwise now that most of them are gone. Tall, taller than any man, with skin like river clay gone pale, and a second lid that slid sideways across the eye when they were thinking hard or lying, so that after a few years you could read a Sarathi lord's honesty by watching the corner of his eye the way you'd watch the corner of a card sharp's mouth. They were slow-blooded. Cold ran deep in them. It took a great deal to move a Sarathi to anger and a great deal more to move him to speed, and they made a virtue of it, called it stillness, put it in all their poems. A Sarathi could sit through an insult that would have 3 men from my world reaching for the table's edge, and he would sit, and he would remember. And 11 years later, the one who insulted him would find his water rights revoked by a clause no one could unwrite. That was how they warred, slowly, in ink, in inheritance. In the long gray patience of people who lived twice as long as I would, and never once forgot a slight. Into all that stillness I brought the loud human hearth. I brought fat and salt and fire and the crackle of a thing seared hard. I brought a kitchen that shouted. The old sovereign, Osmer Sarathi, took me on because I fed his gout better than his own physicians, who kept trying to cool his blood when what the old man needed was to be warmed and salted and made to sweat like an honest animal once a week. I did that. I kept him alive a good decade past what the charts allowed, and in return he gave me the lower kitchens and the yard behind them and asked me only 2 things: feed his house well, and feed his hounds. I should tell you about the hounds, because the hounds are half the story, and because I loved them, which is a thing that will make more sense by the end than it does now. The Sarathi kept Death-Hounds. They called them the Asing. They were gray, low, broad as a man is long, with a hide like wet slate and a jaw that did not so much bite as fold shut, and eyes set so far to the sides of the skull that they saw everything and looked at nothing. They were older than the house, older than the seat. There is a Sarathi word, asin, that means both hound and verdict, and that is not an accident of language. That is the whole of their law folded into one syllable. When a Sarathi court found a man guilty of the unforgivable things, kin murder, oath-breaking against the seat, the poisoning of a guest, they did not hang him and they did not burn him. They walked him down the black steps to the lower yard, and they opened the low gate, and that was the sentence. The verdict was the hounds. The hounds were the verdict. For 1,000 years the 2 words had been the same word, and in 1,000 years, I was told, the gate had been opened perhaps 40 times, which for that patient people was a great many, and each time it was remembered forever. And I fed them. Every dawn of every day for 30 years, before I lit a single fire for the living, I went down the black steps with 2 full pails and I fed the Asing. The court thought this was a low task, a beast-keeper's task beneath even a human, and I let them think it, the way I let them think a great many things. Because the truth was that those hounds knew me the way nothing else in that whole cold house knew me. They knew my step on the stair. They knew my smell. They came to the low bars when they heard the pails, 6 of them, gray and enormous and silent, and they did not fold their jaws at me. They leaned their great heads against the bars to be scratched behind the fold of the ear, and made a sound low in the chest that the Sarathi had no word for because the Sarathi had never heard it, because the Asin only made it for me. A verdict, leaning into a cook's hand to be scratched. I fed the law of that house its breakfast every morning of my life, and the law loved me, and no one thought that was worth a moment's notice. Remember that. That is the whole hinge of it. Now I have to tell you about the girl, and I have to do it carefully, because she is the thing I got right in a life where I got a great many things wrong, and I don't want to smear her by telling it badly. 7 was the old sovereign's last child and his only surviving one, born late, born small, born to a mother who did not survive the bearing of her. Among the Sarathi, a late small child of a dead mother was reckoned a fragile inheritance, a candle in a hall of draughts, and the court quietly wrote her off before she could walk, and made their slow arrangements around cousins and nephews who were taller and colder and more properly Sarathi. And she found the kitchen. She was perhaps the height of my hip, the first time she came down the wrong stair, and stood in my doorway with the grave, enormous eyes of her people, and the stubborn set of a mouth that was all her own, and watched me sear a rack of marshfowl until the fat spat, and did not flinch at the spitting the way a Sarathi child was supposed to flinch at loud, sudden things. She just watched. And when I set a scrap of the fowl on the cold end of the block to see what she'd do, she did not ask leave, which no Sarathi child would have dared, and she did not refuse it out of the cold pride they all had. She ate it. She ate it like a human child eats, with her whole self, and then she looked up at me with grease on her chin, this small pale heir to a seat that had already forgotten her, and she said, in the piping careful court speech they taught them before they could run, "That is the best thing that has ever happened to me. I have cooked for 30 years to earn a sentence like that, and only ever earned it the once." She came back every day after. I should have sent her up. It was not my place to keep the air of the house in a hot kitchen among a human's loud pans. But no one wanted her upstairs. That was the plain truth of it. No one had a use for a small dead woman's small strange daughter. And down in my kitchen she had a stool by the warm wall and a job. She shelled the river nuts badly. Then and she had me. And God help the both of us, I had her. I taught her what my grandmother taught me. Not the cooking, though she learned that too. The other thing. The food knowing. Which root sleeps you and which root keeps you from waking. Which mushroom is meat and which mushroom is a message you don't come back from. How to look at a plate set in front of you by a smiling man and read it like a page. I taught the heir of House Sarathi the one human art her whole cold patient palace didn't have. And I taught it to her the way you teach a thing to someone you have decided, without ever saying so, that you will not outlive by choice. She was quick. She was quicker than me. She had the Sarathi memory that forgets nothing laid over the human hunger that wants everything, and the two together made a mind I have not seen the like of since. She grew. The candle they'd written off did not gutter. She grew tall even for them, and grave, and clever in the slow, lethal Sarathi way and quick in the warm, human way I'd salted into her. And somewhere in her 17th or 18th year, the court looked up from its ledgers and its arrangements and noticed, with the particular Sarathi horror of people who pride themselves on missing nothing, that they had missed everything. That the fragile candle was the only true-born child of the old sovereign left standing. That the cousins and the nephews were cousins and nephews. That the seat, by every law they had, was hers. I watched them redo their arithmetic. I watched the corner of 100 lordly eyes slide sideways with the second lid as they recalculated a lifetime of assumptions. And I watched one man in particular, down the long cold table at the nomming feast where the old sovereign, half in the grave already, formally set 7 as his heir. I watched the Lord Marshal Castor V. Helm keep his eyes perfectly still. You learn, feeding a court for 30 years, that the danger is never the lord whose eye slides. The slide is honest. The slide is a man's body telling on him. The danger is the one who has practiced until nothing slides at all, until the second lid stays back and the face stays clay, because that is a man who has made a life's work of not being read, and a man makes that work of himself for one reason only, which is that he means to do things he does not want read in advance. Castor Wilhelm sat through the nomming of 7 Sarathi as air with a face like a stopped clock, and lifted his cup to her with a hand that did not shake, and I stood at the serving wall with a cloth over my arm, and I thought, as plainly as I have ever thought anything, there is the man who is going to try to kill my girl. I was right. I want you to know I was right early, because what I got wrong later, and it cost more than it should have. The old sovereign died that winter. He died well, as those things go, warmed and salted in his bed, with his daughter's hand in his and mine on his shoulder, because he'd asked for the cook, God knows why at the end asked for the human who fed his gout, and his last coherent instruction to me, in the wet rattling court speech of a dying Sarathi, was not about the seat or the succession or the 1,000-year house. It was, keep feeding her the loud food, Halloran. She likes the loud food. And then he was gone, and the great slow machine of Sarathi morning ground into motion, 40 days of gray observance, and at the end of it the morning feast, where by law and custom the new sovereign is presented to the assembled houses and takes the first cup and the first plate before them all, alone at the high seat, to show she does not fear her own court. I cooked that feast. Of course I cooked that feast. I had cooked every feast in that hall for 30 years, and I cooked this one like it was the last thing my hands would ever do, because it was for her, and because some cold place at the back of my neck had been prickling for 40 days. I did everything right. I sourced every root and cut and grained myself. I tasted every dish myself twice, the way my grandmother taught, once for poison and once for pride. I watched the plates go up from my kitchen to the high seat with my own eyes, in the hands of servers I'd known for years, up the black steps into the great hall where I was not permitted, being only the cook, to follow. And that was the flaw. That was the gap in 30 years of caution I never closed, because it had never once needed closing. My hands were clean all the way to the top of the stairs. After the top of the stairs, the plate belonged to the hall. She took the first cup before the assembled houses, and she drank. I did not see it. I was below, in the roar of my own kitchen, plating the second course, and the first I knew of anything wrong was the quality of the silence that came down the stairwell. A feast makes a sound, a great blended animal murmur, and that sound changed all at once into a different sound, a held sound, the sound of 500 cold people going very still at the same moment, and my hand stopped over the plates before my mind had caught up, because 30 years of feeding a court had taught my body to read that hall through the floor, and my body knew, before I did, that something at the high seat had gone wrong. I broke every law of the house, and I went up the black steps. She was still standing. I will always be grateful she was still standing, because if she had fallen, I think my heart would have stopped on the stairs, and this would be a different and shorter story. She stood at the high seat with the great cup still in her hand, and her face the gray of old ash even for a Sarathi, and her second lid sliding and sliding, fighting to focus, and a fine sheen coming up on the clay of her skin, and the whole hall frozen in the terrible Sarathi stillness. 500 nobles watching their new sovereign begin to die and doing, in that first held moment, absolutely nothing, because their entire civilization was built on not moving first. I moved first. I am human. We move first. That is the whole of us in the end, the good and the bad of us. We move first and count the cost after. I came up the length of that hall in front of every great house of the Sarathi with a cook's cloth still over my arm, and I did not bow, and I did not ask, and I reached my girl and I took the cup from her hand and I put my nose to it, and under the wine and the ceremony and the honey there it was, faint, a smell like cold stone and something green gone wrong, a smell I knew, a smell I had taught her to know beside my hearth when she was the height of my hip. Gray sleep. I want to tell you what gray sleep is, because you have to understand it to understand everything after. It is not a poison the way the crude things are poisons. It does not gripe the gut or foam the mouth or drop a man in the hall to make a scene. It is patient. It is Sarathi. In its way, it works by stillness. It is drawn from the pith of a marsh plant that grows in exactly one province, under exactly one house's control, and it does one thing: it slows. It slows the slow blood of the Sarathi slower and slower over days, cools what is already cold, until the great patient heart of them beats once a minute, then once in 10, then holds its stillness one beat too long and does not start again. There is no thrashing. There is no cry. A Sarathi poisoned with graysleep simply grows more and more still, more and more perfectly the thing their poets praised, until they are the stillest thing of all. It is a poison designed by people who admired stillness, to kill by giving a victim too much of the virtue they were raised to prize. It would have taken her 4 days. It would have looked to the whole cold court like grief, like the fragile candle finally guttering out under the weight of her father's death, exactly as they had all predicted 18 years before. A shame. A weak line. We said as much when she was born. No blade, no blame, no war. Just a slow, sad girl growing still in her bed, and Castor Wilhelm lifting his motionless cup at the funeral, and a compliant cousin on the seat by spring. It was a beautiful plan. I mean that with all the hate I have. It was very nearly perfect. Its one flaw was that the girl had a cook. I turned to the hall and I said, a human, unbowed at the high seat of House Sarathi, to 500 of the coldest nobles in the Reach, I said, your sovereign is poisoned. Graysleep. I need her below in the warmth now, and I need no one to touch her but me. And into the vast held silence that followed I watched exactly one face, and Castor Wilhelm's face did not move, his eye did not slide, his cup did not shake, and that perfect stillness in that one moment told me everything the sliding eyes of 100 honest men could not have. An innocent man is surprised. Only the guilty are prepared. They let me take her, not out of trust, out of paralysis, out of the fact that no one else moved first, and I had, and the Sarathi will follow a thing already in motion even when they will not begin it. I carried the sovereign of the house down the black steps in my 2 arms like I'd carried her up them, sleep 100 times when she was small, past the frozen court, down into the roar and heat of my kitchen, and I laid her on the great warm block by the ovens where she had shelled river nuts as a child, and I began the only war I know how to fight. Here is what a cook knows that a physician does not. A physician treats the body. A cook treats the meal, and the body is only the last course. The Sarathi doctors came down into my kitchen. They came fast. Once someone else had moved first, and they wanted to cool her, to bleed her, to still her further, because their whole medicine was built the same way their poison was, on the worship of the cold and the slow. And I put my human body in the door of my own kitchen, and I would not let them near her, and I said, you will kill her faster than the poison. It works by cold. Everything you know how to do is cold. And they were affronted, and they were probably right that I had no standing, a cook, a human, barring the door against the physicians of the house. And I did not care. I have never in my life cared less about standing, and I held the door. Because I knew what graysleep was. I knew, in the bones my grandmother gave me, what graysleep was not. It was cold and slow and green gone wrong, and the counter to a cold, slow, green thing is a hot, fast, bitter thing, and I had spent 30 years feeding an old man's cold blood exactly such things to keep him warm and quick past his time. I knew the shape of the answer before I knew the answer. I sent my kitchen boys running to the high stores, to the low stores, to the marsh hunters' sheds, and I built over the next 4 days and nights in the biggest pot I owned, with my sleeves rolled and my girl going stiller and grayer on the warm block behind me, the loudest food I have ever made. Fire in it, salt in it, the bitter roots that keep a body from settling, the hot pith that quickens the blood, a marsh toad's gland that I would not feed a well man, but that I knew, drove a slowing heart like a whip drives a tired horse a little, and again a little, time to the fatting beat, warmed and warmed and warmed. I did not sleep for 4 days. I fed her from a spoon a drop at a time when she could not swallow, and I rubbed the warm, bitter broth into her cold clay hands, and I talked to her the whole time, low in the loud human way, told her about the marshfowl the first day and the greasy chin, told her you don't get to be still, do you hear me, being still is how they win, you were never any good at being still, that was the best thing about you, don't you start now. On the fourth night her heart, which had gone down to a beat I had to lay my human ear against her chest to even find, which had held its stillness one beat too long and made me stop breathing, her heart caught. It stumbled and caught, and began to climb, warm and loud and quick, human quick, the way I had spent 18 years teaching her body to be under the Sarathi cold. And her second lid slid back, both of them, all the way, and her great gray eyes found me over her, unshaven and shaking and weeping the way humans weep and Sarathi cannot, and she said, in a thread of a voice, the piping, careful court speech gone rough, she said, "That is the best thing that has ever happened to me." I have earned that sentence twice now. I did not think a man got to earn it twice. She lived. I want to say that plainly and early because what comes next is dark, and I don't want you carrying dread through it that you don't need to carry. She lived. She is, as far as I know, living still on that seat, cold and clever and warm underneath where only I ever saw, ruling that patient people better than any of them expected and exactly as well as I did. She lived. Now let me tell you what it cost the ones who tried to take her, because that is the part they don't say aloud, and it is the part you came to the fire to hear. While she lay stiff and gray on my block those 4 days, while the court above murmured its satisfied grief and made its slow arrangements, I was not only cooking. A cook's hands can stir a pot and his mind can walk a hall at the same time. That is the whole trade. And I walked that hall in my mind, over and over, the way a plate had walked it. Because here was the thing I could not let go of, the thing that turned in me hotter than any of the bitterness in my pot. My hands had been clean to the top of the stairs. I had sourced and tasted and watched every dish to the top of the black steps. The poison went in after, in the hall. Between the top of the stairs and the high seat, in front of 500 witnesses, someone had put Graysleep in the first cup of the new sovereign of House Sarathi, and no one had seen, because everyone had been looking at her, which is exactly what everyone is supposed to do at a naming feast, which meant the poisoner had known the ceremony cold, had counted on all eyes being on the girl, had done it in the one moment of the one night when a court's whole attention was fixed by law on someone else. That was not an assassin from outside, that was the house. And Graysleep comes from one province under one house's water rights, revoked and granted by clauses no one but a marshal could unwrite, and I had watched, 18 months before, a lord win a long, slow inquire over exactly those marsh provinces, a victory so dry and administrative that the whole court had yawned through it. Castor v. Helm, who held the marsh now, who alone could have drawn the pith, whose face had not moved. But a marshal does not carry a cup. A marshal of the Sarathi would no more have crossed that hall with his own hand than he'd have scrubbed my pots. He would have used a hand, a server, someone with a reason to be near the high seat, someone the eye passed over, someone, and here my own heart went cold in a way the pot could not warm, someone the eye passed over the way the eye passes over a cook. Servants, the invisible hands that carry the plates. He had turned the house's own serving hands against the seat, 3 of them as it turned out, 3 of the cup and plate servers who I had known for years, who I had fed at my own low table, who had carried 1,000 honest dishes up those stairs for me. 3 of them Wilhelm had bought, or frightened, or promised, into carrying up one dishonest cup and swearing they saw nothing, in a hall where by law no one was looking anyway. I knew it was 3 before I could prove it was 3, and I will tell you how, because it is the whole of what I am. It was in the plates, when they came back down. A server who has done a clean night's work stacks his returning plates one way. A server who has done a filthy night's work and is sick with it stacks them another, or does not stack them, or drops them, or will not meet the eye of the cook who feeds him, and I had 30 years of reading exactly how the plates came home. 3 of my servers could not meet my eye across my own kitchen the morning after the morning feast. 3 of them had gone gray-lipped and jumpy and useless. 3 of them flinched when I set their supper down in front of them, flinched at a plate from my hand, from Halloran's hand, who had fed them for years. Because a man who has just helped poison a cup knows in the animal back of his skull exactly how much a cook can do to a plate, and now, too late, he was afraid of his own supper. They were right to be afraid of their supper, but not for the reason they thought. I want to be very careful here, because it would be easy to tell this next part as though I fed them poison, and I did not. I never once broke my grandmother's law. She taught me the 2 arts as one art and made me swear I would only ever use the second in the service of the first, that I would learn every dose that harms only so that no plate from my hand would ever harm by accident, and that I would never make a plate a weapon. I kept that oath. I want that on the record with the dead. I did not poison a single soul in this story. What I did was worse, in the eyes of some, and cleaner, in the eyes of the only law that Hall recognized. And I did it with food only in the way that a shepherd uses a whistle, to move things where they need to go. Here is what I did. I went to the sovereign, to 7, warm now and quick now and rising from my block on the 5th day, weak as a colt and gray with anger the moment I told her what I had read in the cup and the plates and the servers' faces. I told her everything. I told her it was Helm, and it was the marsh, and it was 3 of our own serving hands, and I told her I could not prove it in any court her people would recognize, because the Sarathi law was a law of ledgers and witnessed oaths, and there was no ledger, and the only witnesses were the guilty, and the crime had been designed from the first to look like grief. A human court, maybe, given a year and a clever advocate, might have unpicked it. The Sarathi had a swifter law, an older law, but that law required a confession or the taking in the act, and Helm had built his whole beautiful patient plot precisely so that neither could ever happen. He would sit motionless at her recovery feast lifting his motionless cup, and there would be nothing, that the great cold machine of Sarathi justice could bite down on. He had made himself unreadable and unreachable, and he had done it well. And 7, my girl, 18 years grown, 5 days back from the stillest edge there is, sitting up on the warm block where she'd shelled nuts as a child, looked at me with her father's gray eyes and my grandmother's cold knowledge behind them, and she said, "Then we do not use their law, we use ours." I said, "We don't have a law." And she said, "You do. You fed it its breakfast every morning of your life." God help me, I had taught her too well. Here is the shape of the thing we did. And I will tell it plainly, and then I will tell you the one part I have never told anyone, which is the part that is mine and not hers. The Sarathi law of the oxen, the hounds, the verdict, the one word for both, required a confession or the taking in the act for the ordinary crimes. But the poisoning of a guest, and above all the poisoning of the seat itself, the sovereign, at the sovereign's own table, with the sovereign's own house's poison, by the sovereign's own house's hands, that was the oldest and blackest of the unforgivable things, and the oldest law had a provision for it that no one had needed in 900 years, so old that half the court did not know it was still on the ledgers. 7 knew. She had read every ledger in that house by lamplight while the court ignored the fragile candle. The provision was this, that the sovereign herself, poisoned at her own board and surviving, might name the oxen, might, alone, without court or confession, by her sole word as the wronged seat, deliver the ones who did it to the hounds. It was a terrible provision. It was meant to be used never. It put the whole weight of the verdict on one person's word, and the Sarathi had spent 9 centuries making sure no sovereign was ever cornered into needing it. Helm had cornered her into it himself. He had made the crime so perfect that the only law left to answer it was the oldest and the bloodiest, the one everyone had agreed to forget. She named them. Standing on the 5th day, thin and gray and upright in my kitchen to me, she named the 3 servers, and she named Castor Helm, and she invoked a provision 900 years asleep, and she made it law again with 4 names in a rough voice, and then she looked at me, and we both understood that a sovereign may name the oxen, but a sovereign does not carry it out. That is not sovereign's work. That is the beastkeeper's work. That is the low work, the work beneath even a human, the work of the man who feeds the hounds. And I had fed the hounds every morning for 30 years. Now here is the part that is mine. I did not want to trap them cruelly. I want you to understand that, whatever you think of me at the end. These were not, the 3 servers were not monsters. They were frightened men who had been bought or leaned on by a marshal who could revoke their family's water rights with a clause, and they had made the worst choice frightened small men make, and I had fed them at my table for years. And I did not hate them the way I hated Wilhelm, who felt nothing and risked nothing and moved other men's hands. But the Law 7 had woken did not sort by degree, and the crime had been one crime, and I was past the place where I could afford to be tender to the hands that had carried the cup that near killed my girl. So I did the one merciless thing I allowed myself, and I did it with a meal, because a meal was the only weapon I would ever let my hands hold. I invited them to supper, all 4. A private supper in the lower hall by the yard, to which a summons from the cook from Halloran, who everyone knew was thick with the recovered sovereign, who everyone knew had saved her, was a summons no guilty man dared refuse, because to refuse the cook's supper now was to announce a guilty conscience to the whole recovering court. Wilhelm came because to not come was to be read, and he had built his whole self around not being read. The 3 servers came because Wilhelm came, and because they were more afraid of him than of me, which was the last mistake of their lives. They came down to the lower hall, the 4 of them, to eat from the hand of the man they had tried to make a widower of the seat, and they sat, and I served them. I served them beautifully, I want that known. I served them the finest supper I had cooked in years, every dish clean, every dish safe, tasted twice before them in the old way so they could watch me eat first from each and know that there was nothing in the food, that the cook had kept his oath, that this was an honest meal. And it was. Every mouthful was honest. I did not poison them. I fed them the best and cleanest supper of their lives, and I watched the 3 frightened servers begin, slowly, over the honest food to believe they might be forgiven, might be being welcomed back, might be safe. I watched hope come up in their faces, and I hated the mercy of what I was doing, and I did it anyway. And I watched Castor Wilhelm's face not move, not once, not even to eat with pleasure. Because he was a man who had killed all his own, tells so thoroughly that he could not even enjoy a good supper. And I thought, that is what you are, you cold, ruined thing. You have made yourself into a stopped clock, and now you cannot even taste the last good meal of your life. And when the supper was done, and the servers were warm and full and hopping, and Wilhelm was still and full and calculating, I stood, and I did the beastkeeper's low work. I opened the low gate. The lower hall shared a wall with the yard. It always had. The court thought it a quaint old bit of architecture, the dining hall of the servants set against the hound yard, a 1,000-year-old joke about who eats and who is eaten. It was no joke. It was the provision, built into the very stone of the house, waiting 900 years for a sovereign cornered into using it, and a keeper the hounds would come for. I opened the low gate between the hall and the yard, and I stepped back through the high door behind me, the keeper's door, the one only I had the feeding key to, and I did not watch. And I want you to know I did not watch, not out of squeamishness, but because it was not a thing to watch, it was a verdict. And you do not watch a verdict, you carry it, and then you look away. I had not fed the hounds that morning. I want to tell you that flatly, without dressing it, because it is the one hard true thing at the center of all this, and I will not soften it. For 30 years I had fed the oxen at dawn before I fed the living, every single day, the law's breakfast, without fail. I did not feed them that morning. I let the law go hungry one time in 30 years, and I timed one honest supper for men who had helped kill my girl to fall on the one evening. The verdict of that house had gone unfed. And then I opened the gate between them, and I stepped back, and I let the two oldest things in that palace meet each other the way the stone had always meant them to. The hounds knew my step. They did not know theirs. That is all I will say about the sounds. That is all anyone will ever get out of me about the sounds from that side of the keeper's door in the dark, with my hand still on the feeding key and my forehead against the cold stone and my girl's heartbeat, warm and quick and living, the only thing I let myself think about while it was done. It was not long. The Asin were the swiftest thing that patient people had ever made. That was the whole terrible point of them. And it was not long, and then it was still. The true Sarathi stillness at last. The stillness Wilhelm had loved so much he'd built a poison out of it. And I opened the door and I went in and I did the last of the low work, which was to call the hounds off with the two words the keeper uses. And they came, gray and enormous and calm, and leaned their great heads against me to be scratched behind the fold of the ear, and made that low sound in the chest that they only ever made for me. The verdict, leaning into the cook's hand, fed at last after a hungry day and glad to see me. I scratched their ears. God forgive me or don't, but I scratched their ears, because they were mine and they had done what the stone made them for, and it was not their sin. It was mine and Seven's, and 900 years of a house that built a room like that and called it architecture. I fed them properly the next dawn, and every dawn after, for the rest of my years, and I never let one of them go hungry again as long as I lived, because the once was enough. The once was a debt I would be paying those gray heads until I died, and I paid it in full every morning at dawn with 2 full pails in both my human hands. The court, when it understood, and it took the cold, slow court a while to understand, and then it understood all at once, the way they did, the court did a thing I did not expect. It did not recoil from me. I had braced to be feared, to be shunned, the human who did the unspeakable low thing, and instead I watched 500 of the coldest nobles in the reach look at the cook they had passed their eyes over for 30 years and understand, finally, all at the same terrible moment, exactly what had been standing at the serving wall of their every feast for 3 decades. That every plate they had ever eaten had passed through my hands, that I knew every dose that harms, that I had known it the whole time, and kept my grandmother's oath the whole time, and fed them honestly 10,000 times when I could have, any night, any one of 10,000 nights, done otherwise, and that the one time the hall had turned poisoner, it was the cook, the human, the low keeper of the low hounds who had answered it, and answered it with the house's own oldest law, and kept his oath doing it. They had thought the dangerous men in that palace were the ones with the marshrights and the marshal's seat and the unreadable faces. They learned, that winter, that the most dangerous person in any house is the one who feeds it, if he loves the right thing and was raised to know what a plate can do, and that he is dangerous exactly to the degree that he chooses, every single day, not to be. That is the human thing, if you want it named, since you came all this way to the fire. It was never the wrath. Any beast can do the wrath. I only opened a gate. The human thing was the 10,000 honest suppers before it. The human thing was knowing every dose that harms and keeping the oath anyway, morning after morning, decade after decade, feeding even the men who would betray the girl, right up until the law itself asked me to stop. The Sarathi admired stillness. They built their whole cold, beautiful civilization on the virtue of not moving first. And in the end their seat was kept, and their line went on, and their 1,000-year house did not fall to a rival marshal's perfect patient plot. Because there was one creature in it who moved first, who was raised on a loud, warm world to move first and count the cost after, and who had decided, long ago, beside a hearth, watching a small pale child eat a scrap of marshfowl with grease on her chin, that whatever else he outlived, it would not be her. She sits the seat still. She is cold to them and clever to them, and every inch the sovereign they never thought the fragile candle could be. And once a year, on the anniversary of the morning feast, she comes down the black steps, alone, in the plain clothes she wore as a girl, to the lower kitchen where a scarred old human still keeps the fires. And I sear her a rack of marshfowl until the fat spits, and I set it before her on the cold end of the block, and she eats it the way she ate the first one, with her whole self, grease on the chin of the sovereign of all the Sarathi. And every year she says it, rough and quiet and only to me, that it is the best thing that has ever happened to her. I have cooked for 30 years and buried more of their dead than I ever fed, and opened a gate one time in a long life that I will answer for however these things are answered for. And I would tell you it was worth it, all of it, the whole long, cold, beautiful, terrible run of it, for those 2 words in a rough voice over a plate of loud food, once a year, for as long as these old hands can still make the fat spit. Keep feeding her the loud food. She likes the loud food. I do, old man, every year I do.